Well, good morning, and just want to welcome you again to our Bible study for this Sunday morning. It's the first Sunday in February, and we're entering into our last month of our study of the Gospel of Mark, and again, looking only at chapters 1 through 3. We have finished the first two chapters, and we will go through this month looking at the third chapter, a little bit broken up differently than you might be expecting. We're going to be looking at chapter 3, verses 1 to 12 this morning. It really is two different sections. As we'll see, verses 1 through 6 will bring to a conclusion one phase of the ministry of Jesus, and there will be some connection there in the sense that he's going to conclude with what he began. We'll talk about that in a moment. But then 7 through 12 will basically introduce us to the next phase of Jesus' ministry. And what you'll see is that as you read through these verses, there will be some connection between what we see in these verses and what we saw at the beginning of the first phase of Jesus' ministry back in chapter 1. We'll look at that closely. There are two different things going on with that transition from one to the other. And our title is Righteous Anger. And that really does fit mainly the beginning of the text that we're going to be looking at. I wouldn't necessarily say that Jesus was angry in chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. Of course, he's concerned with the crowds that are pressing up against him. But the idea of the anger is going to be pointed out in the text that we're going to be looking at in the first half of our lesson. What I'm going to do is we will first listen to the text, chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. And immediately following that, what I will do is go ahead and basically give you the titles or the breakdown of the two sections that we're going to be looking at today. So let's go ahead and do that now.
Another time he entered the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for reasons to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then he asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was completely restored. The Pharisees then went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Jesus withdrew to the lake with his disciples, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea and Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan, and around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the large crowd, Jesus told his disciples to prepare a small boat for him to keep the people from crowding against him. For he had healed many, so those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and they cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was.
All right. Well, as we said, our lesson is entitled Righteous Anger. It easily breaks down into two sections, chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. What we're going to see there is that there's going to be the Sabbath dispute continues. Remember that last week, the end of chapter 2 focused on a confrontation between Jesus and the religious leaders about the Sabbath when Jesus and his disciples were walking through a grain field and they were picking heads of grain on the Sabbath. And we talked about that declaration, or that opened up the declaration of Jesus to the people about his being Son of Man, and as a result, having authority, being the Lord of the Sabbath as well. And that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But what we're going to see in this text also is that as there is dispute about the Sabbath, we're going to see an enlarging of the opposition. Now, we've seen the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes, coming up against Jesus in some form or fashion. And we're going to see a new group introduced into the opposition as we move forward. Second, we're going to see the kingdom ministry continues. And here I'd like to entitle it Enlarging the Audience. We're going to see again some of the things we saw at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. As he ventures on to this next stage of his ministry, the same kinds of things are going to occur, as we'll see. But we are going to see him becoming more and more, or I should say, people are becoming more and more aware of him. And, quote, his fame is being known from all over the place, as we've just heard. We'll talk about that as well. Let's go ahead then and look at this text very carefully, little by little. So, as we go through the text, first, of course, we have the Sabbath dispute continues, enlarging opposition. Want to point out verse by verse here some of the things that can be highlighted for us that maybe sometimes if we're reading too fast, we just kind of skim over and don't take into consideration all that's going on. Let me read verse 1 from the New American Standard, the 2020 edition. And there are a couple things I think are important to point out, maybe if you're reading a different text, for instance. It says, he entered a synagogue again, and a man was there whose hand was withered. Some translations are going to say on another occasion. It may be that it says it at a later time. The text actually says, again, he entered the synagogue. And the reason I bring that up is that remember that chapter divisions are artificial. I think there are times when they are helpful, but the point being here is there is every indication, at least that I can surmise, that what you see at the beginning of chapter 3 is a continuation of the very day that is mentioned in chapter 2 at the end when Jesus is walking through the grain fields with his disciples picking grain, and the Pharisees confront him about that. So it's very likely, though I can't prove it, it's very likely that what happened is they were going through the grain fields. They made their way back to the synagogue. And so it doesn't say it's the same day, but it also doesn't say on a different occasion. It literally says, again, he entered into a synagogue. And so it could be that it transitions right there. And it would fit with what we've seen in previous Sabbath disputes where there were Sabbath disputes back to back. Now, it's interesting. What Mark tells us is they go into a synagogue, and if I were a director of a movie, for instance, I would probably bring the shot in where they enter into the synagogue and then zoom in on the man with the shriveled hand, knowing that what's going to happen is that's going to prompt the audience to think, uh-oh, something's about to happen. Why focus in on this man? And then maybe even zoom in on the shriveled hand, not to be sensationalistic, but certainly to kind of guide the viewer in what to expect. And I think that's what Mark is doing here. He's preparing us. He knows what happened, and now he's preparing us to think about what happened. He says simply, a man was there whose hand was withered. Now, one of the things I want you to think about as we move through this is the kind of Sabbath controversy we saw when Jesus was teaching in the house, probably Peter's house, back in the beginning of chapter 2. And as he was teaching, it was so crowded that 4 friends who wanted to bring their friend on a cot, if you will, on a stretcher to Jesus had to break through a roof. We talked about that. And Jesus responds to this action by uh, basically starting off the conversation and speaking to the man to be healed or to have his sins forgiven. And you're going to see something similar going on here. There is a person who has a need, and it's going to prompt a situation that's going to lead to this confrontation. So note the parallels that you're going to see. I'm not going to make a note of all the parallels, but I do think it's suitable at this point, knowing what Mark is doing literarily as he's concluding a section of Jesus' ministry with Sabbath controversy, even as he's begun that segment. Notice the parallels then with the man who is in need being the center of the controversy, if you will. So what we see here is they're in a synagogue, and we're told that a man with a withered hand, and you might be, what's the point of that? Well, we, as readers of the Gospels, can just sit back and wait. Now what we see in verse 2 is they were watching. Now the they is not identified, but the reason probably is that, again, it's carrying over from chapter 2. And so we can assume that the they would be the religious leaders or these Pharisees. It goes on to say, and they were watching him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So notice what Mark is telling us here. The religious leaders there with Jesus in the synagogue, and of course, they're all in the appropriate place on the Sabbath. They're in synagogue. What's curious is that these religious leaders, the Pharisees, are not there with the motive of worshiping God. They're there spying out to see what Jesus would do. Now, of course, they've had experience with Jesus before, not only healing, but also doing things that they think that are wrong on the Sabbath. And so they're waiting, they're lurking just to see what he does. Now, what I want you to notice is what they don't do. They don't talk to him. What happens, though, is they are just merely watching. What we're going to see in the next verse, of course, is Jesus is going to take a preemptive strike, if I can use that language. He's certainly going to initiate this confrontation. But notice the motive that the religious leaders have. It's Sabbath. They've known Jesus to do certain things on the Sabbath before, things that they think are breaking the Sabbath. But notice their goal is to see if they can find anything that they can accuse him of. Now, notice what they're going to accuse him of: work on the Sabbath. They know that the man with the shriveled hand is there, and they're wondering if Jesus is going to heal him. I want you to let that sink in for a moment. We may have to come back to that here before we leave this passage. But notice that the religious leaders, these Pharisees, are looking to see if Jesus will heal the man, and as a result have another reason to accuse him. Of course, accuse him of breaking the Sabbath, and particularly their understanding of what the Sabbath regulations entailed. And we've already seen 3 other occasions leading up to this where there have been Sabbath controversies. So the religious leaders here are really up to no good. And as I said last week, we have to understand some of them had pure motives in trying to keep the Sabbath pure, simply because they know that in their past, they went into exile for their idolatry and their failure to keep God's laws. And so maybe there's an overcompensation, but their overcompensation has led to a legalism that has become a burden on the people. So much so that even when someone does good on the Sabbath, it's considered bad because it's work. Well, Jesus now knows what's going on. And all that Mark tells us at this point is that Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." Now, again, I don't want to put too much focus on the literary or narrative aspect of this, but I really want us to appreciate the way that the gospel writers put together the narrative. And again, there's a way in which we can see, as it's unfolding, a little bit of what we know about Jesus' character. And as we've already seen here in previous texts already, we're going to see this again later in the Gospel of Mark, and we see it in other places in the other Gospels, and particularly Matthew and Luke, which often parallels Mark at this point. We can see Jesus acting, knowing that he has a motive as well, noting that he has something he's going to use as an object lesson as well. So, unprompted by the religious leaders, perhaps knowing their motives, even as he perceived them thinking about what they were thinking when he called the man on the pallet to have his sins forgiven, and they were wondering who could forgive sins but God alone. Nothing says that Jesus heard that, because they were thinking it to themselves, but he perceived it and was able to address it. Here, we're not told that he knows what's going on in their minds, but I think we've been prepped already by some of the previous lessons or previous texts leading up to this, that that's exactly what's going on. They're thinking, waiting to see if he's going to heal the man and break the Sabbath in doing so. And so what Jesus does is he calls the man up. Now, I want to stop at that point and say, I don't want to put Jesus in a position or present Jesus in such a way that his only motive here is to confront the religious leaders. But I do think that there's a part of that because he's continually trying to teach them something about who he is and what is good. And that's going to come up here in the question that follows. But I do think more importantly, Jesus has the man's needs in mind. Notice that the man does not ask Jesus for help here. In the man who is paralyzed, he personally didn't ask. It may have been that he had asked his friends to take him to Jesus. We don't have that part of the story, but certainly what we have is Jesus initiating the healing once the man is laid down before him. Here, it appears that the man with the withered hand is part of the group. There's nothing saying that he asked to be healed, but certainly what we have is Jesus calling the man to get up and to come forward. He's coming before the people. There's going to be a show in some way. Now, again, let me backtrack a little bit on that word. What I mean by show is, again, Jesus is not doing this as a display to prove his power, to act as a magician in so many ways. That's not really what's going on here. We know that if he wanted to, Jesus could have healed the man whose hand was withered just by saying a word or just by looking at him. And the man could have been healed, and no one would have had to know unless the man spoke up about it. But we do know that what's going on here is Jesus is trying to prove a point with the religious leaders and the crowds around him. And that is evident when we see the question that is posed by Jesus to the religious leaders in this point. So he brings the man before him, and of course, he's before the crowd as well. And he says simply in verse 4, to the people, to the scribes or the Pharisees, all that are in there, and he asks a rather interesting twofold question. He says this: is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do harm? Let that sink in a moment. You have two options. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do harm? He moves that even further and says, is it lawful to save a life or to kill? Now, we'll get to their response here in a moment. This isn't necessarily a true either or, because there may have been provisions even in the Sabbath, or particularly carried out during the Maccabean Wars, when if it were Sabbath, they still would fight. And if that resulted in someone's death, then they know that they were seeking their liberation. But there is tradition about that. To do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill. Jesus is bringing up two extremes. And really what he does is he puts them in a situation of a catch-22. Think about it. If he says, or if their response to him is it is good, or it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath, then he could bring up all the times, even in the recent past, even in the short past that they have with him, uh, to accuse them of their opposition to him because of the good that he's been doing. You say it's good to do, or it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, and yet you've been accusing me of breaking the Sabbath when I healed a man, when I helped uh, feed people, um, and now he's about to heal a man with a withered hand. Clearly, if they say it's lawful to do harm, well, then they're even breaking their own understanding of tradition at that point. But then he moves from kind of a general type of contrast to a very specific and even more extreme contrast. Is it lawful to save a life or to kill? And again, with the exception I made a moment ago with regard to some of the wars that may have taken place in Israel's history that would have allowed or permitted the killing on the Sabbath, the primary focus is that it's unlawful to kill anytime without reason. And certainly on the Sabbath, it would be unlawful. But notice what he says here. Is it lawful to save a life? Now, what we do need to remember at this point is that what the even the Pharisees and the Jews in general understood was that it was lawful to save a life. It really was lawful to save a life. But I think it's later on in Luke, when there are people coming to Jesus to be healed, the scribes and the Pharisees get mad at the people and said, you know, you have 6 days of the week to come and be healed. Come on those days. This is the Sabbath. What's behind that is that what Jewish tradition would allow for is, if it was necessary to save a life, then some preemptive action could be taken. If it was something that was not life-threatening, then it could just wait for another day. And that might be what's behind the objection of the religious leaders to Jesus when he healed the paralyzed man. That may be what's going on here. We don't know. But what Jesus is doing here is laying it out for them very clearly. They are in a catch-22. If it's lawful to save a life, then why would you oppose what I'm doing now? Certainly, it would be unlawful to kill. That catch-22 is very evident because notice the reaction of those that he asks. The text says, but they kept silent. Now, I want to bring up a couple things at this point. One, remember, as we've gone through each of these episodes the last few weeks, when the scribes or the scribes of the Pharisees, and I'm just calling them religious leaders at this point, as a general phrase, as we've looked at these confrontations, they've been rather passive aggressive, either thinking things to themselves or talking to the disciples. And even when they confront Jesus directly, it's not even them, it's not even he that they are are directing their question about. It's about the disciples eating grain. Why is it that they are eating grain on the Sabbath? Why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? In this text, they don't speak to him, but it's clear what we know their action is and their motive is. But Jesus speaks to them, and the same response that we've heard previously, by way of Mark's omission of any response. Here he explicitly states they kept silent. There was nothing they could say. Now, as a result, what we're going to see is Jesus' response, and here is where we are going to see his attitude toward their actions in this episode. They kept silent. Think about it. They couldn't even bring themselves to say that it was lawful to do good on the Sabbath. They couldn't bring themselves to even say that it was lawful to save a life on the Sabbath. And this quietness reminds me of later on in Jesus' ministry, when it's in the Passion Week and Jesus is going through another series of debates and confrontations and conflict narratives with the religious leaders. They come to him and say, by what authority or whose authority are you doing these things? And Jesus follows that up with a question for them. And he says, I'll ask you a question. And if you can answer it, then I'll answer your question. And he says to them, John's baptism, where did it come from? Did it come from God or did it come from man? And if you ever watched the Jesus film, it's interesting to watch them all kind of huddle up in a circle and talk to each other. You have them speaking to one another and they kind of reason it out. Look, if we say that it's from God, if his baptism came from God, then he could challenge us as to why we didn't believe and follow John. But if we say it comes from man, think about that. Well, the people thought that John came from God and that his baptism came from God. And since he was so popular, if we say it came from man, they would be angry. The religious leaders didn't know what to do. And so what do? They go back to Jesus and go, we don't know. And he kind of follows it up with a strong word. Well, then I'm not going to tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. You have the same kind of thing going on here. They're silent. There's nothing they can say. They could have brought themselves to say something, but they said nothing. So here's what we have in verse 5. After looking around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart, then he heals the man. We'll get to the healing here in a moment. I want to address first this idea of his being angry. That is the word for wrath. He is very angry at this. And the question might be, wow, why would Jesus be angry? I've never, why would it be fitting for Jesus to be angry at this point? Maybe he could be disappointed. Who knows? But he's angry. And as I said, this is a word that's often used for the wrath of God as well. We know that it's not an anger that is built on his own personal feeling, but certainly it's a response that probably has been building up since the first confrontation with the religious leaders. And time and again, they've been disappointed and disappointing. And here, there's just another episode where that occurs. I think we get further information about why he's angry because he's considering their hardness of heart. And the text says that he was grieved at their hardness of heart. So notice the mixture there, the anger that he has toward this whole situation, toward them specifically, and then is grieving at their attitude. You can't help but think of the same attitude that God had with the Israelites throughout their history, being angry at them, being grieved. And a number of times when the hardness of their hearts is referenced, what Jesus is seeing in this moment is the same kind of thing that he has seen from his position in heaven next to the Father, watching the history of Israel. He can't believe that they are responding in such an unsympathetic and mean-spirited way. Their lack of response shows their hardness of heart. So he's angry and he's grieved. With that in mind, he looks to the man and says, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And again, there's a parallel there with what you have with the man who was paralyzed. Jesus confronts the religious leaders and he says, which is easier to say to the man, your sins are forgiven, or to take up your mat and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sin. He said to the man, take up your mat and walk and go home. So there's a similar kind of situation here. Here, though, Jesus doesn't speak to them in direct statement first about that. I mean, he's already asked them questions and they've not answered. But he notes that in their lack of response, he does look at the man with the shriveled hand, and he has him stretch it out. And as he's told to do it, he does, and it's totally restored. What's unfortunate, and what it really becomes a pattern as we see moving forward throughout the book of Mark, and though we're going to be stopping our study with the conclusion of chapter 3 in a few weeks, I want you to keep reading through the Gospel of Mark and note what we're going to find as we read further is this growing opposition, not only now from the religious leaders, but other segments of the population. All the while, as we move forward, we're also going to see Jesus' popularity growing among the populace. And really, that's what we said a moment ago as we began the lesson. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 6 bring to a conclusion one phase, and chapter 3, verses 7 to 12 begin another phase. But the other thing that's coming up is that there is an insight, there's an introduction, has already been stated moving through chapter 2, of a growing opposition. We're also going to see moving forward um, a growing crowd of people wanting to follow Jesus, even if we might look on the surface and see some of their motives as wrong. Well, notice what happens in verse 6. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might put him to death. Now, before I talk about the Pharisees and the Herodians, this unlikely coupling of people, I think it's interesting that their motive in getting together is to plot on how they may kill Jesus. This on the heels of Jesus asking them the very pointed question: what is lawful to do on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill? They couldn't bring themselves to say it was lawful to save a life, but their actions indicated on the Sabbath, immediately they left after this miracle and plotted with another segment, an unlikely friendship building, to plot Jesus' death. So their silence of the matter maybe revealed more than we had thought, and their actions really, really reveal their motive and their actions. Well, real quickly, to talk about the Pharisees, which are now mentioned by name, to meet up with the Herodians, and think, why would those guys meet up together? Why did these two different segments meet up together? Pharisees are a religious group. The Herodians were a political group. The Herodians were those that were in favor of Herod Antipas, and as a result, and by extension, they were also favorable to the Roman Empire. Probably they felt because Rome was leading and things were fine the way they were, they figured the more we can be on the side of Herod and therefore on the side of Rome, the more favor Rome would show them. Of course, this is not the kind of attitude the Pharisees would have. But without going into any more detail about this kind of thing, I want you to see what Mark is doing and what you're going to see the Gospels doing in general. Because we're not going to see the Herodians again until chapter 12 of the Gospel of Mark. What you're seeing here is Mark letting us know that down the road, the plot against Jesus is going to be both religious and political. Because what the Herodians are going to be able to do is demonstrate that Jesus is some kind of political threat, whereas the Pharisees recognize him as a religious threat because he's not fulfilling their understanding of what it was for God to send Messiah. One last thing I'll mention, just because I haven't had the opportunity to mention it the last few weeks, is the fact that we get that word immediately again. Notice they were quiet when Jesus asked them a question, but as soon as Jesus healed the man, they immediately went out to conspire with the Herodians about how they would kill Jesus. The text really stops at that point, and though there's another verse, and we do have chapters and verses, I want you to see how what we have at the end of chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 3, is a double Sabbath story that was first begun in chapter 2 with a double Sabbath story. Now, the ministry of Jesus begins prior to that, and so there is an introduction to that at the middle and into the end of chapter 1, where there is reference to Jesus going about preaching and teaching the kingdom, where there is a what was I going to say? There is a summary of his healing, of his teaching, of his casting out demons. We're going to see that in this text as well. And so what Mark is going to be doing in verses 7 through 12 is, whether it's in I think it's intentional, but what it does for us if we're paying attention is that he's giving us a summary statement of the next phase of his ministry. And so let's take a few minutes to talk about that. We won't take a long time to do that, given that we've already dealt with some of these things before. But notice in verses 7 through 12, the kingdom ministry continues. And we see, as I mentioned, the enlarging audience. The text reads this way: Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples. Now, again, the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Herodians, are out plotting. Jesus is going in another direction. He's on to the next thing. Okay. We know that his attitude is not to trouble himself with what they're going to do with him. He knows when his time will be, and at the proper time, he will make sure the events carry on in the way he has directed them. But Jesus has more ministry to conduct. And so we see in verse 7 this: he withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a large multitude from Galilee followed. But we know that his fame, if you will, or awareness about him has spread in other regions through word of mouth, and that there are people there now who have come from Judea and from Jerusalem and from Idumea, and then also beyond the Jordan, which would be on the east side of the Jordan, and the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. We're told that a great number of people heard about everything he was doing, and they came to him. Now, I want to stop for a moment and share with you a map. I know that you can look in your Bible maps, but I want to go ahead and show you something really important that will kind of guide us through this. As you can see on the screen, there's a map. It's not the greatest of maps. It is helpful. It is something if I zoomed in more, I would lose the entire north-south orientation here. But as you can see, the region of Israel here, or Palestine as it would have been called, is divided up into regions. And so you see where the Sea of Galilee is. There's an arrow there. I didn't put that there. I'm borrowing this map from ChristianityToday.com, from someone's article. But you can see the Sea of Galilee, or Sea of Galilee, and you see Galilee, the region there. You see Samaria south of that. Then you see Judea south of that, and below that is Idumea. And the map continues on below that. And then you see on the east side of the Jordan, you see the region of Perea and the Decapolis. That idea of the Decapolis may run a little bit further north than what you see there, but this is good enough. When you look further up into the region of Phoenicia, you can see on the coast then the cities of Tyre and Sidon. Now, there's more that we can talk about. I just want you to see a couple things here. Up to this point in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is around the Sea of Galilee. It's possible that some of the Pharisees that have been following him around have come from Jerusalem, and maybe from the word of mouth of the Pharisees in Galilee. But word of mouth is spread about Jesus among the populace as well. And so there are people as far south as Idumea and Judea, and specifically Jerusalem. Then you can see on the eastern side, there's no reference to Samaria at this point. We do know that Jesus himself will go through Samaria on a couple of occasions during his ministry. And of course, from Galilee, that's expected. That's where Jesus has spent most of his time. But then you also have other Gentile regions, like you would on the east side. You have Gentile regions from Tyre and Sidon. It's interesting that they come from those places. As you read the gospel narratives, you're going to note that ultimately in Jesus' ministry, he will pass through and minister in all of these regions except Idumea. Now, we don't know why he doesn't go to Idumea. Maybe he had intended to. Maybe at some point in his ministry, he actually did, but we don't have any record of that. We do know that Herod himself, the one that was the ruler in Bethlehem or in that region when Jesus was born, was from that region as well. So there might be some connection there. What I want you to see, though, also is how far and wide Jesus' ministry is growing, because not only are these people going to him, there will be times throughout his ministry he will go to those regions. And that's why I wanted to mention the enlarging audience. It's a twofold enlarging. It's an enlarging audience numerically, but it's also an enlarging audience geographically, in the sense that they're coming from different places, and ultimately places he will go as well. So I want you to note that, and note that when the authors give us this kind of information, we want to stop down and pay attention to that, because there will be some play that comes in to view later on. So we see him gaining this large following. And then in verse 9, we're told this: he told his disciples to see that a boat would be ready for him because of the masses, so that they would not crowd him. Um, he knows the big crowds are growing. Um, he's along the shore, and it could be that this event or series of events that's building is still in Capernaum. It could be very likely that the synagogue that they were in verses 1 through 6 was the synagogue at Capernaum. It could be now that as Jesus is enlarging his ministry, getting ready for that next phase, he's still in Capernaum along the shore. Crowds are pressing up against him, and he says, "Have a boat ready. It may be necessary for me to get in that boat and push out to teach." We do know on another occasion, early in Jesus' ministry, even as he's getting ready to call Simon, in another gospel, he's told uh, Jesus tells Simon to push out into the sea a little bit, so that when he talks to the crowds, the lake will kind of project his voice a little bit. And it's after that, of course, that Jesus tells Simon to have a great catch of fish. That's another story for another time, I know, but it is interesting. We do have in Mark's gospel this very brief reference to his being uh, to have a boat ready. Why does he have the boat ready? Why are they pressing up against him? What's going on? He said in verse 10, "For he healed many, and with the result that all those who had diseases pushed in around him in order to touch him." And so we see another reaction to Jesus. We've seen the reaction of the religious leaders, their opposition to him. Here we're seeing Jesus in his benevolence, his preaching and teaching is leading so many people to follow him that they are pressing up against him. They're just wanting to touch him. We'll see later on, well, you will see later on when you continue to read the Gospel of Mark. But you know the story of the woman who had the issue of blood when Jesus was going to heal and then ultimately raise Jairus' daughter. On the way, a woman with an issue of blood who'd been seeking physicians' help for 12 years, just touched his garment and she was healed. The same kind of thing was going on here. Something led them to think, well, he touches other people and they're healed. Well, if I just touch him, just get a touch of him, well, this is going to be causing a mass chaos. And what Jesus says is, have that boat ready. Many, many were seeking to touch him. Notice their reaction. Up to this point, Mark, in this particular episode, is not telling us about his teaching, although it's assumed. What we do see, though, is this group following after him because of his healing ministry. And so, while the religious leaders have a wrong motive for opposing Jesus, it may be that the crowds, with their limited understanding of who Jesus is, has a wrong motive in seeking to follow him. Verse 11, we have another response to Jesus. "And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they would fall down before him and shout, 'You are the Son of God.' And he strongly warned them not to reveal who he was." Again, we saw similar things going on in the end of chapter 1, where Jesus was going about teaching about the kingdom. He was healing, and he was also casting out demons. And here, as there, they knew who Jesus was. And I would venture to guess that the demons calling out, these unclean spirits who are possessing the people, when they're calling out to Jesus, "You are the Son of God," they're not proclaiming him Son of God. Tradition had it that if the demon could call you by name and understand who you were, that was the first step that they could have toward manipulating you. Jesus would have none of that. Notice what he says. He warned them not to reveal who he was. We'd seen this earlier in the Gospel of Mark already, where he had told an individual, for instance, a leper, to go first to the priest to tell what God had done for him and do the sacrifices or to do the practices that Moses had instructed. But the man goes off and tells people about Jesus. Uh, Earlier, these same kinds of demons were talking about who Jesus was, identifying who he was as the Son of Man. And he told them not to do that. So we understand what's going on there. This is another practice, another event. Probably, as we've said over the last weeks, that one of the reasons for this is that many would misunderstand what it meant for Jesus to be Messiah. But as we've seen, Jesus is revealing who he is as Messiah on his terms, on his time. And we've seen that already in a number of the episodes in chapter 2. We've seen already a couple of times where he's referenced himself as the Son of Man and the authority that he has as the Son of Man. Well, we see that taking place here. As we said, we see Jesus healing and dealing with impure spirits, calling them to be silent, but there's a response there that we have. And so what I'd like to do is kind of conclude our discussion today with some responses and have kind of a time of application, if you will. So let's look at some of these. One, different responses. Now, I'm not saying we do this, but I'm wanting to question whether we do from time to time or as we see the world responding to Jesus. So what I'm going to do is parallel some of these questions related to the responses that we've seen in the passages that we've looked at this morning. Do we despise or reject Jesus because he does not fit into our view of things? I didn't change all my pronouns when I wanted to update my question here. Or when he doesn't meet our expectations. Maybe he's not exactly what we expected, and therefore we just don't like him. We're not going to have anything to do with Jesus because he doesn't fit our mold. Religious leaders were looking at Jesus, and because they found him to be disobedient to the laws that they had in mind, they were going after him. Maybe sometimes we look at Jesus and we don't think he fits what we think he should be. And as a result, we may despise or reject him. And we know that there are people in the world that do. So it may not be that I'm talking to you specifically, but if you are a person who is struggling in your understanding of God and your relationship with Jesus, maybe evaluate why that is. Is it just that he doesn't match up what you think Jesus should be? Many people in the world like to quote Jesus. They like to cast him in their own image, but he will not be cast into our image. He reveals who he is as one in authority. Maybe we could be, or maybe we're like the crowds. Do we follow Jesus solely to have him meet our temporal, material, or physical needs? Now we know that in John chapter 2, as after Jesus had cleansed the temple um, and dealt with that controversy, he stayed in Jerusalem and went about healing many people. And it said that as a result, many put their faith in him. But it says that he didn't put his faith in them. It's the same word. It says that they believed in him, but he didn't trust in them because he knew what was in a man. He knew at that point early on the reason for following him, the reason for believing in him was because he healed them. We see that here in our brief lesson today as well. The crowds are pressing against him. He's healed many people, and many more people come to be healed if they could just touch him. Do we sometimes look to Jesus only for the purpose of having him meet our needs, whether it be a material need, a financial need, a physical need, or what? And maybe then we're disappointed when he doesn't meet those needs. Maybe we oppose him, though we may not know exactly who he is because he's intruding in our lives. Or I should say, knowing exactly who he is because he's intruding in our lives. Think about the demons at this point. They're called the impure spirits or unclean spirits. They see Jesus. They're possessing the people that are in the crowd, some that are seeking healing. And as we've seen in previous text, uh, Jesus has this confrontation with these demons. They're opposing him. They're calling him out. They know exactly who Jesus is, but they're trying to have control of Jesus. But of course, Jesus would have none of that. Do we sometimes oppose Jesus, knowing exactly who he is, knowing he's Son of God, knowing he's Lord of the universe, and yet he's intrusive in our lives? Because as a result, if I'm to allow him to be Lord of my life, that means he's going to be in my business, so to speak. And we know what it means to change our lives in light of that. There are many people who refuse to follow Jesus because they know in order to follow him, they have to give up things that they love, things that they think that they love. They have to give up certain freedoms. Never mind, Paul went on to say in so many terms that our greatest freedom is being slaves to Christ. As we conclude, I want you to think about those questions. Always, what I want you to think about moving forward is what these texts are telling us about Jesus. What we're going to be looking at next week, let me share that now before I forget, and we'll go on and pray after this. But as we go on into next week, I think it's important to think about what takes place. Jesus is going to take the disciples that he's had following him, and he's going to have 12 specifically that he will designate as apostles. And you may look at the title, Choosing the A Team, and I know you're going to think about the TV show from the 80s. I'm looking at the list of the apostles and wondering, why would our lesson writers call them the A Team, knowing that they were such a ragtag bunch of people at times? But if the A is short for the apostles, then we'll go for that. When we look at that next week, we'll see Jesus' call of the apostles. I wanted to bring that up now, though, because that's going to be one more kind of parallel in the next step of this next phase of Jesus' ministry to what we had in the previous segment of Jesus' ministry. Remember that as Jesus is going around teaching and preaching and casting out demons, he calls two sets of apostles, or two sets of disciples who will be in this group that will become apostles. What Mark does here and what the other gospel writers will do as well, Matthew and Luke specifically, is have this list of those apostles as they're called. So we're going to see moving forward what God is doing through Jesus, moving forward into that next phase of ministry. Well, I want to encourage you to keep reading. I know that we still have a few more weeks left, but I do hope that as you read and finish up with Mark chapter 3, that you'll continue on to read through the rest of the Gospel of Mark. And one of the things I would also do is I would encourage you to make a point to study the other Gospels. One thing I didn't mention was that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke also have parallels to these two stories. There was one version of it, in Matthew's version, where it wasn't Jesus calling on the religious leaders about what is good and right to do on the Sabbath. It was the religious leaders posing that question to Jesus. Either way, what is at stake is the controversy for those in the crowd listening is what is the appropriate action on the Sabbath? And of course, ultimately, what does God require on the Sabbath? And ultimately, beyond that, it's something like what we find in the Old Testament. God telling the people, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and we will be preparing for worship and then looking forward to the week ahead. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you again for Mark and the other apostles and other authors who, by your inspiration, put down into writing the things that Jesus said and did. And while we're often curious about the things that he said and did that are not written, I pray that you will help us to ponder, deeply think about what was given to us and what is the text telling us about Jesus as we read verse by verse and episode by episode. Help us, Father, to evaluate who we are in relationship to Jesus, what may be our resistance to Jesus. For those of us who have given our lives to Jesus, I pray that day by day and moment by moment, we would be yielding ourselves to his lordship, and that by your Spirit, we will live the life you've called us to live. We know that down the road, Jesus is going to talk about taking up one's cross, denying oneself, taking up the cross, and following him. I pray that we will renew our efforts to do that, renew our resolve to do that day by day. We just pray right now that you will accept the worship that we present to you, and that it will be not just a 1 day a week event, but that this moment of worship will be the culmination of a week of worship, and then it will also spur us on to a day by day act of worship through the life that we live. We love you and praise you, and we give the study to you and our lives to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, I hope that you do have a good week. I know that there are many challenges that you're going to face, but God is going to be with us, and we need to see and feel and know that he is with us always, even as he's promised. Until the next time we are studying the Gospel of Mark together, be well and be blessed.